Practice panel discussion, and today we will be talking about lessons from Harvard after the Claudine Gay Affair. We've got a great group with us today. I'll start introducing people the way I see them. We've got Elizabeth Spivak, who is a professor of psychology at Bridgewater State University. She's also an ILV fellow, Institute for Liberal Values, as well as the podcast co-host for the Dissidents podcast. We have Ken Pope, who has worked for years in Russia, the former Soviet Union, focused on communism and its impact today in America. We have Wingfield Twyman Jr., my co-author of our book, Letters in Black and White, with me, who is also a Harvard Law School graduate, and Eric Smith, who also actually wrote the foreword for our book. Thank you, Eric, who is a senior researcher at Cato and the co-founder of Free Black Thought, as well as a director for the Institute of Liberal Values. And I'll be moderating this talk. I'm Jennifer Richmond, also a director at the Institute for Liberal Values. So with that said, Wink, I'm going to start this discussion with you. You are a Harvard grad. You've actually written on the Claudine Gay Affair and your feelings about it in Newsweek, and we can add a link to that after the live stream. So my first question really is to you, and it's as a Harvard grad. I just want you to give us a rundown of what you think happened at Harvard. Why did Harvard feel it was necessary in the first place to promote Claudine Gay? What was her undoing? What lessons do you think we can carry from this situation? And has Gay's resignation led to fundamental changes in the way Harvard operates? Feel free to jump in on any of those questions at any time, but sure. First goes to you.
Well, Jen, thank you for that nice introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here today. In terms of your questions, I want to make it clear. Yes, indeed, I graduated from Harvard Law School back in 1986. In fact, over my shoulder, you'll see the Harvard Law School diploma. And on my other shoulder, University of Virginia. These two schools compete for my affections. Sometimes UVA is in the running, and sometimes the Crimson Wave is in the running, but nowadays I feel more aligned with UVA perhaps than with Harvard, but I'll get into that in just a bit. On to your questions. Let me first say, I don't have any inside information, so I'm not privy to the inner workings of the fellows of Harvard College or the Board of Overseers or the President's Office. I just wanted to make that clear. My connection clearly is as an alum of the law school from 1986. Let me also add that I really can't offer an opinion in terms of how and why Claudine Gay was promoted to the presidency. I was not privy to the deliberations of the search committee. They did not reach out to me for my opinion, so it would be inappropriate for me to speculate on what led to her promotion. But having said that, I can certainly comment on the other questions you raised. What led to her undoing, for example? I'm quite eager to address that one. In my opinion, Claudine Gay faced a downfall, and it happened over a period of months, let's say from October 7th, when the Hamas terror took place, to January 2nd, 2024, when she officially resigned. Number one, I recall when I read about her appointment to be the president of Harvard University, and I remember I didn't jump for joy. I think there are some Black people who felt like this was an important barrier to break through. This is the first Black president of Harvard University. If you read the internet, you would see gazillion articles proclaiming that. I didn't feel that way, Jen. I felt that way in my life in the past. For example, in 1977, when we had a Black mayor of Richmond, Virginia, yeah, that was cause for visceral celebration because a racial barrier had been crossed in the capital of the Confederacy, I might add. I felt that way in 1989 and 1990, when Governor Doug Wilder was sworn in as governor of Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. That was a real barrier that was broken through. And of course, when Barack Obama was elected president in November 2008, well, God, we all ran into the street and screamed and shouted and hollered because we felt viscerally that an important psychological barrier had been broken for Black Americans. And to me, quite frankly, Jen, that was kind of it. I kind of called it a day in terms of the race story, because to me, at least, if you could become president of the United States of America, then really the world is your oyster, and race no longer is an effective barrier to achievement. So when I read that Claudine Gay had been promoted to the presidency of Harvard, I didn't feel anything. In fact, to be honest, I was a little bit unnerved because I recall her treatment of two prominent Black male professors at Harvard. One would be Professor Roland Fryer, who engaged in some unpopular research regarding police shootings of unarmed Black men in Texas. And the second was a Harvard law professor, Ronald Sullivan, who I thought was a courageous lawyer in that he was willing to offer representation services to Harvey Weinstein, who was very disgraced back in the Me Too movement. So from what I remember, Claudine Gay had been a part of, if not an instigator, in efforts to terminate and remove those gentlemen from their various positions. So I thought to myself, we should feel good about the first Black president of Harvard, but this is the same person who's been involved in shady dealings to get rid of, at some level, two Black prominent male law professors. It did, two Black male professors at Harvard. That didn't sit right with me, but I didn't dwell on it. I have a life, I have a family, I'm busy. So I carried on. And then when I was in New Haven, Connecticut, visiting a daughter, that was the weekend that Hamas committed their atrocities in Israel. And as a Harvard grad, I was expecting, the president of Harvard University to voice outrage about that, right? It was a moral depravity. And I waited among the elm trees in New Haven. And then all of a sudden I read this statement from not Claudine Gay, but the former Harvard University president, Larry Summers. And he voiced righteous moral indignation. And I thought, but where is our president, our current president, Claudine Gay? And I waited a day, nothing. I waited a day. And then I read some kind of weak denunciation of what had happened, but not a full-throated condemnation. That didn't happen for another 2 or 3 days. And so in my mind, I thought, that's troubling. To me, that's a sign of moral incompetence, that you are blessed with the leadership of one of the premier institutions in the world, and yet in that level position, you're not rising to the moral moment. And that troubled me. But I was willing to forget and move on because I am a busy person. But then I remember in December, maybe in December 5th, Claudine Gay offered testimony before Congress. And she was questioned point blank by a member of Congress. Does calling for the genocide of Jews depend upon the context? Well, the answer to me was clear, and to many Americans and to many global citizens, genocide never has a context. And I was flabbergasted at the response of the president of my university, Harvard. And I thought in that moment, you're not really showing the kind of moral leadership in the moment that I associate with the leadership of Harvard. For example, the former president Larry Summers. For example, the former president Derek Bok. For example, the former president Neil Rudenstein. I mean, all of those gentlemen, I believe, would have risen to the occasion, and you would have felt a greatness of moral virtue and character in a moment. I didn't feel that way with President Gay. So I, at that point, called for her to resign because I felt that that was an important step to make for the university and for the university's brand and for the university's sense of self. But then I moved on because I have a busy life. But I was intrigued by the whole issue of Claudine Gay. And then I noticed, Jen, that there were allegations of plagiarism. Not one, not two, not five, not 10, not 20, not 30. And as the allegations mounted, I thought to myself, this is just craziness. And not just that, but then there were some wordsmithsmen at work in Harvard Yard. It wasn't plagiarism, it was citation errors. And my sense is when people play word games with something which is vital to the life of a scholar, that's a problem. One night, out of curiosity, I'm a very curious man, Jen, as you know, I decided, well, how does Claudine Gay, whom Professor Glenn Lowry has spoken of in less than positive terms in terms of her publication rate, I was wondering, well, how many books has Claudine Gay published? And so I did some research, and I went back through the 1900s and the 1800s and the 70s. There had never been another Harvard University president who had never self-published a book since some president of Harvard in the year 1773. We were still a colony the last time a Harvard University president had not published a book. So to me, it was time for Claudine Gay to resign gracefully. And so when she did resign on January 2nd, 2024, I thought that was a good outcome for the former president and for Harvard University. And one of the things I think I learned from this situation and what Harvard can do in the future will be three things. Number one, choose a president based upon merit. Cast aside these non-essential traits, these surface features like gender and race and ideology. Go for the best possible person. I mean, I was watching actually a podcast this morning by Eric Weinstein about this issue. And he said someone he knows at Harvard feels these are the best days Harvard will ever know because now we're committed to DEIE or DEI, I forget. Sorry, Jen. And that we will see troubled times ahead for Harvard. Well, I hope that's not the case. But the way to stop that is to, one, focus on merit, not non-essentials for the next leader of Harvard. Number two, and I think this is really important, because of the clear moral failings, let's have a president who excels in the spiritual, who excels in philosophy, who excels in these questions of moral dilemmas. I mean, I would love to see a sterling star scholar of divinity or theology as the next president of Harvard. I think that Harvard, in some ways, has lost a spiritual way, and you may need a spiritual shepherd in the president's office to return Harvard to its golden days. And then number three, most importantly, Jen, you need to feel you're in the presence of greatness when you encounter the president of Harvard University in the yard. When I was in law school, Jen, and I'm a dinosaur, I'm a fossil, I admit it, I'm a relic from the past. But I remember when I was a law student and I would encounter the president, Derek Bach, you just sensed you were in the presence of greatness. You felt like the man exuded confidence in himself and the institution, that he brought favor upon the university. We need someone like that, someone who's in their 30s, maybe 35, someone who has a clear vision of Harvard University beyond the year 2050. That would be my thought. So to wrap up, because I've talked too long, Jen, talked too long, even today, there are people making pitches to me on a race basis to encourage the Board of Overseers and the fellows to preserve to preserve diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I just think that's so problematic. We should come together as a Harvard community, not out of racial solidarity, but out of unity in the conviction that Harvard University can, again, be a great beacon, shining city on a hill in Boston. And those are my thoughts, Jen.
Thanks, Wink. Well, I'm going to turn now to Elizabeth, because you, Wink, and Elizabeth have done several podcasts on this. And this is actually what started us thinking about this panel discussion, was this idea that, is the tide really turning, particularly on issues of DEI? So there are several of our friends and good colleagues like David Bernstein, who's a director at ILV, and Lee Jessam, who have suggested that perhaps the tide is now turning. This is DEI has reached ascendancy. It's past its prime. We're moving on. And Elizabeth, kind of pushes back on that idea of, are we really moving on? So Elizabeth, I'm turning to you. What do you think the people who suggest that we're moving into a new era or DEI is past its prime, what are they missing?
So it is true that at least 7 now states have passed laws to prevent, more DEI offices. They're calling for the, dismantling, to, quit mandating training, and considering, some of these, DEI qualifications in hiring. And there's 16 more states that are considering it, at a minimum. But here's the thing, like at Texas Tech, for example, what happened was the Black Cultural Center simply became the Student Enrichment Center. So the LGBTQ plus campus space sort of closed, but it reopened as the Gender and Sexuality Center. So all the people, the people who, run these are just 2 examples, are still there. And there's, they're helping student groups to take over, some of those same, activities. So now I don't know whether they can get students to do all of those things. But basically, these are just, examples of how not much changes. It's not like people are getting fired because the state has said, we are not going to have, we're not going to allow you to have a center for this. They just redistribute people, and they, redistribute, just slap a new name on the door, and the same things are going on. So they're doing sort of the bare minimum to make changes, to do the same thing. And look, if I believed, as many of these people believe, that that's the right thing to do, I would most likely do the same thing. I'm not, condemning them for using the best strategy. So student groups can take over, and they're facilitating that. University of Michigan, for example, $80 million on a to hire at least 30 diverse faculty and develop a mentoring program for those 30 faculty. And that's an NIH partially funded NIH program. It's like 15 million of it is funded by NIH. So the main issue here is that we have a culture that cannot change because Claudine Gay got stepped down, because they embarrassed themselves in front of Congress. And Wink, you mentioned like a 35-year-old or whatever, something in that neighborhood. Well, that age group is the biggest offender. PhDs in that age group are the biggest offenders, under 35 PhDs. So this is 2020 data. I mean, I could go on forever, but 64% of academics, 76% of social science academics favor political correct speech over freedom of speech. So they support that people should censor themselves. They support for diversity. Quotas is similar, and they prioritize decolonizing the curriculum over free speech, social justice pursuits over academic freedom. And again, it's the strongest. It's driven by young PhDs. So these are people who aren't going anywhere, right? If they're in the system, they're going to remain in the system. They're going to get tenure, and they're going to be continuing, the process. Extreme liberals and I shouldn't say extreme, but people who are highly identified either as very left or very right conservatives are the most willing to discriminate against what they perceive as their opposing, ideology in hiring, in approving grants, in approving symposium and research conference presentations, approving papers, even sitting with someone at lunch. People do not want to be seated next to someone whom they believe is their ideological opposite. And it's 20 to 30% of conservatives and 15 to 35% of liberals. So we have a bigger problem of self-censorship and the norm of self-censorship. And Eric can speak to this better than I can if he has time, but listeners and speakers are engaging in it's sort of a role playing, right? It's a performance, and there's certain stories that are, story structures or skeletons or scripts, schemas, however you want to think about it, that we're expected to use so that the listener will understand what we're talking about. And they encourage us to tell those kinds of stories. We organize our world according to these. And so we have certain social expectations that aren't going to go away because Claudine Gay stepped down. And I, in fact, Wink and I talked about this. I was sorry that she stepped down. In fact, she hadn't quite stepped down, I think, when you and I had our podcast. Right. I was hoping that she wouldn't, because I feel that Harvard got to have their cake and eat it too. They got their scapegoat, and they got to say that it was horrible that she had to step down because she was a victim of cancellation. The very thing that, as you rightly pointed out, she has perpetrated on others. But when she's at, there's a big article, I'm just south of Boston. So, I get the Boston Globe, read the Boston Globe, big picture, front page. Claudine Gay is at a basketball game, getting all these hugs. The governor goes down and sits next to her and tells her how sorry she is, how awful it is, how she's been treated. So she's making, $1 million a year almost. She's making the same salary she was when she was president. She's now teacher. It's not, she didn't lose her job. Like, she tried to take other people's jobs and tenure. And she's going to be, she's taken care of and has some of the advantages that she tried to strip others of, which is this social support. I don't believe she's ostracized. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's very unlikely that she has suffered the social death that many people who are canceled suffer. And this is a little aside, not what Jen asked, but I think that her testimony, when she said it depends, I think that when they said, is calling for the genocide of Jews, against, the university policies, and she said it depends, I think the problem with that answer isn't that it doesn't depend, because I think it does depend. If somebody's in their dorm room and they say that kind of thing, you know what? I think we are under some obligation to not hear everything, that somebody means as, an attack on us personally. The problem with what she said was that it was hypocritical, because that is not the standard, as you pointed out, that she has used against others, against people like Carol Hooven and Roland Fryer and others. She engaged in hypocrisy that I think was deserving of having to resign. And as you know, I won't go into the plagiarism thing, but I have some objections to some of the plagiarism thing too. So DEI or DIE, yes, has become a way for colleges, for faculty, for administrators to appear and to feel personally progressive, to feel like they're contributing, to teach without teaching content, to be liked and to be seen as virtuous. You know, I'm going to tell this example really quick, and it is an example not because it's an outlier. Like, I want to be clear. A lot of times when I tell examples, you know, people are like, oh yeah, well, that's just one student. But this is not just one student. So this is just a recent example that is rampant. So I'm in teaching, you know, upper level students right now. I had them read an article that was about college cheating. And it wasn't because it was about college cheating. It was for other purposes, because it's a research methods class, and it was a good article to sort of look at for methods that I was trying to teach. Almost to a student, they complained that the research study they essentially thought that it was useless because there was not an even distribution of males, females, and race and ethnicity. And so my question to them was, so why would you ask that? Well, because, you know, it has to be equitable. We have to include all, you know. So you're telling me that you have a hypothesis about cheating and race? Would you care to share that with me? So what we're teaching them is this superficial stuff about, you know, even in their upper level courses about what it means to do ethical research. What it means to do ethical research is to make sure that you have equal numbers of different humans, even though this is a human behavior study. It's not a study about race. It's not a study where we would be concerned that some people might be left out of getting, you know, medical treatment, or might be abused or something like that. This is just a human behavior study. But that's what gets them the check. That's what gets them the points, right? Is to say that there is some inequity. So we're instilling this sort of superficial view of education and of what it means to be, you know, to have equal opportunity, that unfortunately is, you know, dumbing down education. And that lack of standards, that lack of sort of consistency in education is one of the reasons why people don't think education is worth it right now. We have real issues. We have grade inflation. We have AI. We have the cliff in terms of traditionally college age students who are available to go to college. Universities are closing because there aren't enough students to go around. So the students now who are at community colleges, who are at four-year colleges, are people who in the past may have not been able to get into college. They're getting accepted now because the good students who didn't used to get into the top tier schools or the flagship schools are now getting accepted because there's simply fewer students. All applications are down. So we have a combination of lowered standards, grade inflation, sort of teaching inspiration, teaching awareness over content, taking sort of credit for, you know, looking like an activist as opposed to really doing research in your field. My significant other calls this boundary work, where when you are in a field, you know, so if you're in biology or you're in, you know, psychology, like I am, I don't know anything about COVID-19. I don't know I don't know anything about Black Lives Matter. But suddenly you know, I'm going to apply a social psychological theory to Black Lives Matter, and so I'm going to publish, or I'm, you know, try to publish on the boundary of somebody else's, you know, field, and so we suddenly have this explosion of, you know, of COVID-19, you know, papers, and we have this explosion of racial and ethnic equality papers in all fields who are publishing on the boundaries of their fields. They don't have to do the hard work of research that takes a long time, lots of false starts. They can publish essentially an opinion piece in an academic journal. So you can get presented, you can get presentations, you can do all this stuff without really, you know, doing what I would consider the hard work of experimentation and such. So I'm also going on too long, so maybe I'll save other things for later. But my main point is that simply you cannot change a culture that is now, you know, we've got all this money behind it. Nobody's going to get fired over this. Maybe people will choose different careers, and it will slowly, you know, sort of rearrange itself. But I think this is, we have educated, indoctrinated, I hate to use that word, you know, a whole generation. And I don't see that, really going anywhere.
So I'll take this then to Eric. Eric, when I introduced you, one of the things that I didn't introduce you as, and that some people may or may not know, is that you used to be a DEI director. And now you're at the Cato Institute, and also, you know, with ILV, Free Black Thought. I would love to hear from you. Where is DEI illiberal? And where did you see that illiberalism playing out in Harvard?
One of my biggest regrets of the last year or so is telling people I used to be a DEI administrator, because now that's who I am.
You're
the guy who used to be doing this stuff.
You're that guy.
So now I have to address that. I'll do it now. It's fine. But when I was doing DEI, it was nothing like what we see now, which I would categorize as critical social justice backed DEI. It was something much more in line with classical liberal values, free speech. You know, I was leaning into the color blindness thing, right? Equality before the law, right? And the original meaning of affirmative action, which is twofold. Don't discriminate based on race. Make sure everybody is aware of and has access to resources. You know, that was it. It became quota systems and things like that, but that's the original meaning of it. I was in that boat, you know. Nevertheless, I still decided afterwards to never do it again. I mean, even that kind of DEI just wasn't working. I didn't have tenure. I had no power, you know, and nobody had to go to my trainings or anything like that, so they didn't, right? I feel like I was there for optics. I was there for the administration to say, see, we're doing something, right? So that's the long and short of that. When it comes to contemporary DEI, the DEI undergirded by critical social justice is nothing but illiberal, you know, in a lot of ways. And you know, if I listed everything, we'd be here for a while. But what it does, what it discourages the most, right? And this isn't explicit to a lot of people, but what it discourages the most is individuality. If you take individuality out of all of this, it crumbles, right? So they have to demonize individuality. And then, you know, my field, you know, individuality, that's bad. Hyper individuality, they say. Individuality is no longer a word. Hyper individuality is a word, and that's what they're using. Why? Well, it's easy to speculate that, you know, if this one thing is going to totally destroy our ideology, we got to destroy that one thing, right? So we get rid of individuality and we embrace this prescriptive essentialism, right? And what I mean by prescriptive is, there's a script, right? There's a list of characteristics and things you can say if you're going to be an authentic Black person, right? Or an authentic Latino or whatever, right? And if you don't abide by that script, if you so much as dare step on the lines of a white person, right, you are demonized. I speak from experience on this. And they have to do that, though, right? Think about microaggressions if there isn't racial essentialism, right? Not every Black person is going to be upset when he hears somebody say, I think the most qualified person should get the job, right? We are individuals. We're not clones of each other. We're not the Borg or anything like that. Nevertheless, this doesn't work unless every Black person takes offense to that, right? That's the selling point. You're harming Black people, which strongly implies that they all think the same. They all interpret the same. They all have the same goals and same outlooks and things like that. So essentialism is essential to contemporary DEI. You take it away, it crumbles. What else? Oh, well, deliberation, right? Or lack thereof. Deliberation is very important, especially in a free and, civil democracy that we're supposed to be in. You're allowed to, you are expected to sell your ideas in the marketplace of ideas, so to speak, regardless of whatever industry or institution you're a part of. That's not the case anymore, right? Deliberation means you're going to bring up something that we disagree with that could harm the Black people, right? You can't say that. There was something going around last week about a debate that was canceled or something like that because one side of the debate thought that the resolved statement was, offensive or something like that. I forget what it was, but it was the point of debate is to hear something you don't like and address it, right? Or to hear something you disagree with and address it. That's the entire point. They didn't teach that. They just got rid of the debate. That's where we are right now. So free speech, deliberation, right? Critical inquiry, those things are not the basis of epistemology anymore. Now it's lived experience. You can't deliberate my lived experience. You can't ask me to elaborate on this. You can't point out the several gaps in my story. How dare you? That's discriminatory on your part, right? You're doing me harm, right? Which is really weird in academia, where deliberation is supposed to be embraced. So we're academics, and by being academics, we're doing you harm, right? Just being academics. This is what it's supposed to be. So what else? Why is it? Oh, well, this isn't necessarily illiberal as much as it is misguided. If you are going to embrace a DEI initiative, it can't be one size fits all, right? People read one book and apply it to every college, every department, and every college, every school, without going into that school, looking at the context, the specifics of that particular institution, and acting accordingly, right? Based on what they need, right? Different demographics, different all kinds of things. But we have this one idea about how to go about things. That's just, from a practical standpoint, well, impractical, right? You can't do these things in this way. If you are going to have a DEI initiative, it has to be contextual, it has to be kairotic, is what we may say in my field, right? The window of opportunity based on the demographics there, the environment, all kinds of different things. You got to think about this stuff. This stuff is hard, right? What else? Well, there's a lack of pragmatism, obviously. And this speaks to the low-hanging fruit tendency with a lot of this stuff. You know, we feel like if we change the name of a building or a bridge, we've done something, right? We didn't solve any problems. We didn't solve hunger, right? We didn't do anything. We did something symbolic, right? It's become that. Even Richard Delgado, I think, who is, you know, a CRT scholar, complained about this in an essay about 20 years ago or so, right? Making the distinction between idealist and realist anti-racism, right? The idealists were winning out, right? He says something like, it's easy to complain about a meme or something like that. It's much harder to get a policy changed. So you're going to do the first one and say you did something, right? So we see a lot of that going on as well. And it's also, it's a lack of pragmatism and a lack of teleology, I want to say. And I say that because of this. If we really want to help minority students, Black students, let's say, we want to give them the tools that will best ensure their happiness and fulfillment in society, right? That's what we're supposed to be doing. Well, if we're supposed to be doing that, if that is our charge, then we can't say things like, I think it's inherently racist to teach Black kids standard English, right? Or the writing standard English, which is a skill that will probably come in handy, you know, at some point in their careers. Right. So we're in the name of racial justice, we're taking away the things that would help them be happy and successful in this society. Why is that? Because, well, it's not about the students as much as it is about society. If those kids go out there, if those young adults go out there, right, get jobs and are happy, the status quo is maintained. If your problem is the status quo, then, you know, you have a conflict of interest there, right? It's not really about the students. A lot of these DEI initiatives are doing the exact opposite of helping. You know, they're harming. Last thing, and then I'll shut up. A lot of what's going on today, whether it's DEI or not, whether it's just a quota system or something like that, is we're trying to do too much too soon, right? If we want to, you know, raise the number of Black students and Latino students in a school while maintaining rigor, that's not going to take 2 years, right? It's going to take a while. The cultures have to change. Outreach has to change. All kinds of different things have to change. And then we'll see results down the line based on what we're starting to do now. Now they're like, okay, have 40% Black people in 2 years. All right, well, this is Vermont. I can't. You know what I mean? It's so we need more time to do the things we say we want to do. And if we're going to do something that takes 10 years and 2 years, you have to have a quota system. You know, you have to have some kind of soft quota or something like that. You have to, you know, I don't want to say getting rid of rigor, but okay, fine, I'll say it. You have to forego that, right? If you're going to do it in 2 years. So that's another thing that's happening. And whether you're a critical social justice DEI person or the DEI person I was trying to be 15 years ago, right? You got to have a realistic time frame. Now I'll stop talking.
I have to interject something as an aside because you mentioned Vermont. I have a family member who's a pale male. I like to say that's a pale male who was applying to med school at the University of Vermont, and when he got the the brochure, there was not one pale male on the University of Vermont's medical school brochure. So just an aside. So all right, Ken, I end up with you, and I want to do so because we've been talking about DEI, and I think that what you do and the work that you do, you see DEI as a project of something more than just, this kind of surface level DEI stuff, making sure that there's quotas and whatnot. You really look at these neo-Marxist tendencies and trends and ideologies, and you see that kind of from our discussions woven through a lot of these initiatives and DEI initiatives. Can you give us a little bit more background on the neo-Marxism that we're seeing involved in such initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Jen. I appreciate the introduction. It's been great listening to all you guys, share your thoughts on this. I mean, it's a very important topic, especially in the realm of education, where I think I want to kind of keep this. I think, first of all, I would say that this really isn't anything new. This Marxist movement, neo-Marxist, if you want to describe it that way now, has been around really since the 20s and 30s, starting with the Frankfurt School, critical theory. I mean, it kind of metastasized, it goes forward in the later 60s with the German socialist student called Rudi Deutsch, who coined the term the long march through the institutions. And I would argue that thought process and that ideology very successfully hopped upon and is, it entrenched itself in the United States through a lot of our institutions. So the goal in each one of these cases really is to create radical change in the institutions and government by becoming part of the system. So think about some of the things you guys have talked about this evening already. So I would submit they've been very successful in doing that through virtually all institutions across the country, but also even corporate America today, especially in the education field. So really what we say, or how we like to think of the Marxist agenda, I mean, I think you go back to Marx and, what did he really loathe? He loathed capitalism, individualism, freedom of thought. He didn't really care for that. He wanted a cookie cutter society based on his ideology of creating this thing called socialism that would one day morph into communism. And he said something very interesting in the second chapter. I'll just read you this quote because I think it's very telling. And it kind of gives us to where we are with this. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties: formation of the proletariat into a class, the overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, and the conquest of political power by the proletariat. And power, I would argue to you, is what a lot of this is really about. I think that's kind of the key motivator for a lot of these movements. And you think about today, some of the things that you've discussed. Think about the awesome power some of the DEI organizations have on college campuses. They have the ability to destroy a student's career or a professor's career based on, what could be a thoughtless comment or something else out of their past in a blink of an eye that quickly. So I think Marx then, but also his modern day acolytes, see this world as this, we kind of talked about a few minutes ago, the oppressor of the oppressed, with kind of the U.S., the capitalist system, call it white supremacy. In some cases, some iterations of this is kind of the root cause of all the woes of the world. And the imagery they use is remarkably similar to what we see in the Soviet era. BLM, liberated ethnic studies, use all kind of the same imagery that you saw during the Soviet period. I think that's not the only commonality they have with these guys either. So instead of dividing by class, as Marx kind of envisioned this, they're dividing it by, race, ethnic group, gender, identity. So it's basically a physical characteristics as opposed to, what they did with class. And it's really viewed as the oppressor of the oppressed. And they're really, I think the purpose of this ideology is to bring about more of a socialist type environment, be it on campus, be it in the government. I think that's their ultimate agenda. And if you think about what they're doing at the university level with some of these programs, and also K through 12, we're seeing a lot of that there as well. It's really, I think a lot of it's indoctrination. It's not really teaching a student to think critically, not how to think, but what to think. They're telling them this is how you should view the world based on some characteristic that you really have absolutely no control over. So if you think of DEI officers and staff in the context of education, kind of Marx it saw this kind of this elite group that's going to lead everybody down the path of righteousness. And I think that a lot of this is the same way here. Is I think a lot of these programs are talking to people from the perspective of, well, you really don't understand that you've had this problem all along. Let me help you figure this out. That's the purpose of my job. So this intellectual elite's going to lead this process along. Marx called this the dictatorship of the proletariat because they wielded total power. I think there's a lot of that going on here. Marx sadly, his theory ended up killing about 100 million people. We don't have that problem, thankfully, today, but they are damaging and causing a great deal of destruction in the way they approach people and things. So also these groups, this dictatorship of the proletariat in Marx's case, never went away. And I can't think of a DEI organization that has worked itself out of a job yet on any university campus or any other aspect of where we see it today. And I think, Elizabeth, you started down on a couple of statistics. I found a very interesting report based in 2021. It was called Diversity University, DEI Bloat in the Academy. They looked at 65 universities that were members of the 5 power athletic conferences. So you got the Atlantic Coast Conference, you got the Big 10, Big 12, Pac-12, and SEC. And this is what they found at these universities. Average of 45 DEI positions per university, average of 3.4 DEI positions for every 100 tenured faculty, 4.2 times the number working in DEI as opposed to Americans for Disability Act programs, that really assist students with these disabilities receiving reasonable accommodations as required by law. And 1.4, this was an interesting number as a history buff, is 1.4 times the number working in the history departments across these universities, which is not surprising. Is reason why, when I talk to students across university, they have no idea about communism or the history of communism or Marxism or socialism. The data shows these colleges, these vast DEI bureaucracies, really doesn't have a relationship to the students' satisfaction with what's going on their college campus or even their experiences with diversity. So I think it's really, to me, it's very problematic. And this ideology is much like Marx in his day or Lenin in his day. It's very dogmatic. It's infallible. To question Soviet authorities, for example, or the party, you're going to be labeled a reactionary, you're going to be a defeatist, you're going to be a traitor, and you'd be punished as such. And I think, in some of the worst examples of DEI today, you're viewed as you're denying your oppressor status, or you're fragile, you're defensive, you really don't think about this the right way, or just in some of the worst cases, you're just called a racist, or have some type of phobia. And I think that's the frightening aspect of that to me. And it really, I think, as Eric hit on, does one thing that really bothers me is that it stifles debate, and I think that's the intent. Is you can no longer debate intelligently. You can no longer have this thing because it's intellectually acceptable to not have that analytical rigor, to think about the world not as we would wish to see it, but how it really is. And it might cause somebody to be uncomfortable. And I think as long as we have that there, we are not going to improve our educational system in this country. It's going to continue to be what it is today. I think our standards are falling across the board in a lot of key areas, especially in the area of history and understand civics, of what this nation, by virtue of our foundational documents, what we're promised, as citizens. And I think some of these programs, as they're being instituted across the country today, kind of flies in the face of those fundamental values that we used to hold very close to us.
So I've got a follow-up question for you on that. Like, let's just have a thought experiment. Let's say DEI is dead or it's on its last legs. How do you still see kind of Marxist? I've got one answer to this question, but I'd love to hear what you have to say. How do you still see these ideologies and this pedagogy infiltrating education, even if like DEI is out the window? Do you see that Marxism going with it, or do you see other avenues that Marxism is infiltrating and the ideology is infiltrating our American education system?
I think it just changes its name. I think Elizabeth hit on this a few minutes ago. It's really nothing is really changing. Really, I mean, the ideology. A lot of these people really firmly believe in this. Marx or Marxism, the theory. They think his theory was simply not done correctly. It was corrupted. Was never done the right way. We should give it a try again. I don't think those people are going away, especially in the generations, from basically from the high school level up through as Liz was talking about, age 35. Some of your professors now, I think they're fully bought into this ideology. It's been in the education system for years. There's a great book, and I'm just going to read one more statistic called "The Naked Communist." This was They listed 45 different steps that the communists that this guy saw, former FBI agent, a college professor, this was actually read into the congressional record. And this is what he wrote. Number 17, get control of the schools, use them as transmission belts for socialism and current communist propaganda, soften the curriculum, get control of teachers' unions, and put the party line in the textbooks. So this was not done, 10 years ago. This was written in 1958 and read in the congressional record by a Florida Democrat back in 1963. So this was, again, the long march through the institutions. This has been around a while. And it was there then. He was seeing it kind of clearly as a professor, saw it as an FBI agent, probably working, some counterintelligence stuff, I would think at the time. But this is something that this guy saw unfold over the years, and we can still see it, some of these things today. The name will change. Think of some of the, one of the examples is the Confucius Institutes on the universities. When all this China stuff blew up, what do? They say they're going to go away, right? They changed the names. They're still coming back on campuses. They never really went away. And this is going to be the same with, in my view, as the Marxist piece or the socialism piece. It's not really going to go away. There's too many people who really believe it or are insufficiently educated about it to really make an informed decision, and they're not willing to explore it. Hence, history.
I'd like to add that to answer your question, Jen, they just abolished the DEI. Let's not forget that universities have to get accredited, and the accreditation process involves presenting the accreditation agency a plan. And I don't actually have the numbers right in front of me, but I did a search, just a word search. I didn't do I didn't look at it very hard. Just did a search for equity and race and racial and that kind of thing in the one that was 10 years ago and the one that was just submitted. And it's like race appears in the 10 years ago as in terms of descriptive statistics, okay? But the term race in the current accreditation materials appears, it's like 177 times. It's insane in the same length of a document. Equity appears like 7 times, but 42 times. And again, the numbers are like more than an arm's length away. But my point here is that the accreditation materials that get submitted and get approved are what universities will be judged on in another 10 years. So you cannot dismantle something that you have made a 10-year commitment to an accreditation agency, because they will come in and they will say you didn't live up to your end of the bargain. So they are not necessarily imposing it. The universities have imposed it upon themselves to say this is our plan. And so then they have a strategic plan and short-term, and longer-term goals to meet that plan. And so what we see now is, for example, in community announcements, 9 out of 10 community announcements today are race, social justice, and so on, and so on, and so on. So you're getting more of the same in order to, fulfill these long-term goals. So you simply can't, if you just get rid of the offices, which you can't because they are embedded. They are part of the administrative bloat at a university, and they're embedded into our, to other, industry and that kind of thing. So it literally could not go anywhere for at least, if somebody just got accredited for another 10 years, because you've got to, meet those goals.
Yeah, I would just say on that too, that, just as you're looking at this, you're right, Elizabeth, it's not going to be, you're not going to snap your finger and make this go away overnight. They did a long march through the institutions. I think that's a great quote from their perspective, because that's exactly what it was. It took them a long time to do it. I think because most people, when they saw this coming up, they thought, well, all those guys are fringe. Nobody's really going to take them seriously until it's too late. It's been adopted kind of wholesale at this point. So it's not going to happen overnight, but I think there's a lot of incremental steps, as we discuss later on. There's things you can do that would start the process maybe coming back to a little more of a moderate or reasonable position than where we are right now.
Ken, if I can follow up on your point, I tend to be an optimist. So I wanted to brainstorm two possible ways to bring about a better time, a better condition. And I would love to get your perspective on my two ideas. So one idea is simply this. Generations come and go in cycles. So every generation, in a sense, is rebelling psychologically against the ways of their parents, the ways of their elders, because they know better. Is there a chance that, although we're now in a nadir in terms of this social theory and conditioning, is there a chance that the next generation that is born in the 2030s and the 2040s, when they come of age, will psychologically rebel against this dogma, because that's what children do, that's what teenagers do. And as they come into their adulthood, they will dismantle the system because they feel they know a better way of doing things. That's idea number one. Idea number two, could it be the case that we simply need to find our hovel? Is it possible that we need to, in a sense, think about ourselves as Prague in the 1960s or the 1970s? Is the way to a better tomorrow the thinking that you have to reject words of manipulation? So the dogmatists use words like, and I actually read some of these words from a letter I got from Black alumni of Harvard Law School yesterday. Equity, diversity, inclusive, ally, BIPOC, DEI, racist, citation errors, dog whistle, dialogue. That's my favorite. But all of those words, in a sense, are slogan words. And Havel in Prague would have recognized them as such. And in Prague, what happened was in 1978, there was a prosecution of the plastic people, I think, of the universe. People basically became very upset that humanity was being stamped out. And at some point, a breaking point was reached, and the system fell apart when people refused to mouth the slogan words. So is there a chance that could be the better way out for us? So those are my two questions to you. Generational cycles and a new Prague in the US of A.
Yeah, I think I'll start with the second one first, because I'm a big fan of Havel. I use him quite shamelessly in all my talks.
Right.
Because I think the key thing about him and his compatriots in Charter 77, they were incredibly courageous. I mean, we worry about cancel culture today, where back then cancel culture had a lot more bite to it. You could be shot, you could be imprisoned, which these guys were. But I admire them. I tell people a lot. I've been to combat, so I've been shot at. I know that's a very uncomfortable feeling. I had the ability to shoot back, so I felt better about that. These guys didn't. These guys stood in facing the guns unarmed, and all they had was their words, and they were very eloquent, and they could tell compelling stories, and that's what they did. So those guys are, in my view, true heroes, because they stood against a monolithic system and brought it down. It took decades to do it. It didn't happen overnight. And I think there's that. I think people, and like Solzhenitsyn said, don't be the one to let the lie come in. He stood against it. Same thing. He served a lot of time in a gulag as well because of it. But I think, brave men and women need to stand up and say, no, I'm not going to parrot the lie. I'm not going to parrot the slogan, because that's all it is. It's a slogan. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't change anything. And so I think generationally, going back to your first question, I think yes. I think, I'm an optimist too. I think there's great hope. I'm seeing a lot of, talking to some of my kids and their friends, I'm hearing their perspective on this stuff, and they think a lot of what is being said out there is utterly ridiculous. It's defying. It's like the communists did during the Soviet era in China, all over the world. The economy's failing, and there's mass famine. Well, no, the economy's great, and nobody's starving in the Soviet Union. What are you talking about?
Right.
Everybody can see it. Nobody believes the system anymore, and I think we're kind of rapidly approaching that. We're just, common sense is being challenged at every step of the way. So there's good signs. There's also bad signs. I mean, there's a report out, Cato, where came out recently. There was a survey that 30% of people under the age of 30 would be okay, or think it would be is a good idea to have cameras in people's homes to monitor their behavior.
Whoa.
That to me is horrifying. Those of us who grew up in the 80s
Right.
can't even imagine something like that. So I think that's, I think there's good indications, but I think the key thing is it's going to take a lot of work, and it starts with brave people standing up and just saying, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to parrot.
So we've got a question, and any of you can answer it. First, what do you think is the most important issue raised by the Claudine Gay Affair? For example, integrity, double standards, free speech, etc. And second, how do you think students could be taught how to think versus what to think about this issue? Open it for anyone.
Well, you already know that mine was hypocrisy. Like I felt that was the worst offense of that congressional testimony, was the hypocrisy. And I wish that I knew the answer, or an answer. I don't think there's the answer. I think there are probably a lot of answers, but I wish that I knew what to do about teaching, and the what to think, and because it isn't just about teaching. It is also about this generation of learners. And we have, every person has a device in their hand, and if I, the attitude is, if I ever need this, which I won't, I'll just look it up. And so there doesn't seem to be a universal value placed on knowledge. So just because knowledge is in the palm of my hand whenever I want it. So I don't value, knowledge for its own sake. So it's, there's, the eye rolling and the disengagement. I think it's not just about it. There's no like way of teaching to change that. And like Eric says, certainly not in the short term. Without what we have done, as is lower the standards, and not just at the college level, but all the way through. So people you don't fail students anymore, because if you fail them, you have to show that you have to have a paper trail, that you have intervened, that you've engaged with the child, that you've contacted the parent, that you've done all these other things. It's easier to just pass them. And so we have people, I just read an article the other day in the Globe. People are in advanced placement high school courses who are reading at the 5th grade. So they are in an advanced placement class because they got the grades to get in an advanced placement class, but they are reading at the 5th grade. So they cannot pass the state exams, but they're taking advanced placement courses. So, we have bigger problems than just what somebody is standing in front of the room and teaching. But people like me, even though I have tenure, to challenge students is to invite complaints. And complaints that the university president has an open door policy. You can come anytime you want and complain in any way that you want. And so, we get called on the carpet if students complain. They are now going to issue reports that list who passed our courses and their race and ethnicity. So the report says, I was not at this meeting, but I got all the materials. So I'm interpreting the materials based on, there's a little bubble with an arrow that says one more Black student would have needed to pass your class for there to be grading equity. Now, this wasn't my class, I say your class, but it's an example because it's a PowerPoint presentation. One more Black person. You know how many Black people were in that class? One. You know how many white people failed the class? Half of the white people failed the class. So, so there's one Black person and, 12 white people, and the multiracial people all passed. So what's the I don't know what the problem here is, but there's so much pressure here to not hold people accountable and to continue to push people through this sort of drive-through. I ordered at this window, I paid my money at this window, and I collect my diploma at this window. So we have it from both. We're getting squeezed from both sides. Even any teacher who really, and I think most teachers think that they want to do, they're doing what they're doing because they believe in it. Whatever it is. And I may disagree with them on some things, but I don't think most teachers are passing people because they think that I think they're passing people because they feel that they have to some extent, and whether that's because they think there's inequity or because they're being pressured from the parents or the administration, are being squeezed. I don't know, but I wish I knew the answer. I do hold I do what I can.
Off the perspective, Jen, if I might, I love Black history, and so I kind of look at the question from that perspective, and so I would agree with Elizabeth. Standards is definitely a concern. When I look at Black history, in particular the history of Black college presidents, you think of George Boyer Vachon, who was a college president of Avery Institute in the 1860s in Pittsburgh, known for and remembered for a personal letter making the case for American citizenship of Black people to Abraham Lincoln. And some people believe that caused Lincoln to accelerate his issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. I look at the college president of Virginia State University, John Mercer Langston, who not only was remembered as the first Black lawyer in Ohio, but founded Howard Law School, was acting president of Howard University, and was the first Black congressman from Virginia, remembered in sterling terms. And then I think about Booker T. Washington, who created Tuskegee Institute, remembered as one of the leading intellectual figures of Black enterprise and Black business in the South in the late 1800s. A man who wrote 14 books. He didn't have a word processor. He didn't have a Mac. He was writing up those books in the countryside of Tuskegee, Alabama in the late 1800s. All right. I think of John Hope, who was so fair-skinned, he was the son of a Scottish immigrant. He could have chosen to be a white American and have said, goodbye, I'm not going to deal with these problems of these Black Americans, too much for me. No, he cast his lot with Black people and created one of the most endearing Black colleges in American history, Morehouse College, and he's remembered for that. Then there's Mordecai Johnson, a young Baptist preacher chosen at the age of 36 to be the president of Howard University in 1926, in the racial nadir of our history. He turned that school around. He made it into a national institution. He brought on board the top Black intellectuals and scholars and writers in the country. He single-handedly secured federal funding for Howard University on a permanent appropriations basis. By the time he retired as president in 1960, everyone knew they felt his greatness on campus, in other words. So my point is, when I think about Claudine Gay as the first Black president of Harvard University, how far we have fallen in Black American history, right? Compared to some of those great luminaries I've mentioned earlier. That's kind of my perspective.
I think, the question, Jim, you talk about how do you get students, or how do we get to the point where we're teaching people how to think as opposed to what to think? I think it's got to start with the teachers, and I think it's two things. I think it starts with the teachers, but I think it also starts with with valuing education again. But I think when I was working teaching at the university level, teaching intelligence and national security studies, especially on the intelligence side of the house, you're always trying to teach these people to think very critically. It's lives will depend on it at some point. So my point was, you need to be asking a lot of questions that start with why, or what makes this so, or how would something like that work? And I think too many people today, I think students, I think teachers, probably the younger teachers, because they grew up with what they're now teaching, not too many years prior to that, is that they see something on their iPhone or computer, whatever, and that, regardless of any modicum of throwing any common sense toward it, that becomes law in their mind. It's fact now because I saw it on the internet, and without any type of critical thinking whatsoever, or just asking the serious questions. Why would this be so, or how would that really work? I think if we can get to that point, then I think we're going to start doing that. Then things like saying that some of the ridiculous things that we hear today, and either in DEI or somebody who's got this very socialist bent about why it's such a great system, they can ask some reasonable questions. I think the other side, they don't want that. That's why they're pushing so hard to indoctrinate, vice, educate, and there is as we all know, a fundamental difference. That's just my.
Well, I think that touches on something that I wanted to kind of go to with regards to how we're seeing Marxism still kind of playing out in our education system. And this is something that all of us here have worked on in one way or touched in one way or another, is we're seeing now this introduction of what's called liberated ethnic studies, which really isn't that different from DEI. I mean, it's teaching like the more group identity, less about individuality. And so, and it's really based on Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. And so it's not called DEI, it's called ethnic studies. And of course, I think that the idea behind ethnic studies is lovely, to teach about all the various facets of American history and American life. But the way it's being taught, I see that as another way that we're seeing these kind of Marxist views and power plays play out in the American education system. And that's concerning. So until we have teachers, who are so in teaching institutes, this is the doctrine that they're being taught. So the teachers, I really feel like until we start to address how we're teaching teachers, we're going to continue to see this education, seeping through our system, K through 12 up through academia. And it really starts with how we're teaching teachers. Eric, you've been quiet. Any thoughts to share?
No, I am having a good and productive time listening to all this intelligence. I've learned a lot tonight, and I'm very thankful for that.
What's interesting is this is, and probably Eric, you too, this is what I thought that I would be doing as an academic, having conversations with people, about different things. I mean, I don't agree, for example, that there's some kind of conspiracy to, infiltrate the institutions. I think it's concept creep more than anything. But, having these conversations is what I thought that I would be doing as an academic, and not just with my colleagues in the hallways, but, even with my students. I used to have really rich, interesting, deep conversations with my research students and with some students, in my classes. And that, the loss, the sense of loss that I think, unfortunately, most of us actually feel but don't know how to deal with, is really sad. I mean, I think that, the moderates really hoard their opinions, and because to disagree with DEI in any fashion is to attack it, to disagree with social, critical social justice in any way feels like an attack. And so I don't think most people are on board, but those are the people that aren't speaking up because they're afraid. And that's why I think that it's going to take a long time to change, because we have a culture now of norms. The norm now is not free speech, but self censorship.
And that's one of the things, Elizabeth, that so troubles me is because, as Jen well knows from our book together, I grew up in the opposite environment. I mean, I grew up literally 10 miles from the capital of the Confederacy. I grew up in a southern suburb long, long time ago, in the 60s and 70s. But I remember you could always disagree without being disagreeable, that I was always the only Black kid in my class. And I always made it a point to ask the most questions. I remember that in junior high and high school, because I wanted to be number one in every class. So I had my hand up all the time. And I always tried to read a book a day in junior high school. And in the history class, I would always read all the recommended readings after class was over. And so, ironically, in a very traditional Southern place, I felt far more free, Elizabeth, as an intellectual than I do in 2024 in San Diego. What's wrong with that picture? I mean, have we, in a sense, exiled true free thinkers and individuals in the Black experience to the gulag, the virtual gulag of our isolation? Are we prisoners of our own device, as the Eagles said in Hotel California?
I think it's, I think it takes one person to, again, to take a stand. And what they're going to find is there's more people in the room than you possibly would have imagined. And I learned this lesson kind of, randomly. I was giving a talk to about 65, I guess, school teachers. And I was thinking, okay, they're, probably, you always look, is it disagreeing? Are they sleeping? What's the reaction I'm getting?
Right.
And nobody, it's just stoic, everybody's just sitting there looking at me and then thinking, okay, well, they probably, a little more, I was told they're probably a little more liberal, so they're probably not going to agree with a lot of what you're going to be talking about. Within, about 10 minutes in, I see this one guy in the kind of like the back corner of the room. He starts nodding his head this way. And then I'm going, okay, there's one at least. And then a couple minutes later, people around him started doing the same thing. And then before you know it, a lot of people, probably 60 to 70% seem to be in agreement with, at least kind of the gist of the history of this thing called communism that they had not heard before, as some of the questions indicated. So I think it's just that. I think people are really cowed now. I think they're afraid. And I always encourage teachers when I'm talking to them is that I seriously doubt you're going to be the only one in the room. And what somebody else in that room is looking for is somebody else to take the first step. Be the Havel, be the Solzhenitsyn who's going to stand up and say, you know what, I'm just going to be that guy. And I'm hoping to bring a lot of you with me because it's the right thing to do.
I like that answer. That's a good answer.
Well, thank you, everyone, for being part of our inaugural panel. I'm going to add in this panel notes some of the names that we dropped and some extra resources. And for those who want to continue to join us on these panel discussions, subscribe on Circle or look at our newsletter that you can subscribe to at ilvalues.org and be informed on when they come up. Speaking of which, and before, on Saturday, Wink is giving our Liberal Values Lab on Lemuel Haynes. So we're very excited about that. So check the calendar for that as well.
An incredible man. We've not had a chance to meet his descendants, and there are few American stories that are as unsung as his American story. And I look forward to sharing that with other people this Saturday.
Same here. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.